He's fascinating for the same reason that he's terrifying. We're all fascinated by the idea of a return to Eden and a freedom from the burdens of society. And yet, we're terrified by the reminder of how quickly social institutions could break down and we'd be left with pandemonium. So, Charles Manson, one of the most famous and notorious convicted murderers in American history, despite the fact that the murders for which he was convicted, 7 counts, were ones that he did not carry out with his own hands, and it seems he wasn't even in the room when these murders happened, nor did he hire or pay the murderers, right? This wasn't a hire a hitman situation. This was a case of a cult of personality expressing an ideology that was apparently so influential over his followers that they committed the most brutal of murders in the summer of 1969. And see, if you don't believe me about this ideology, would you believe Wikipedia? Right? Because we've got the prosecution. The prosecution contended that while Manson never directly ordered the murders, his ideology constituted an overt act of conspiracy. So I'm going to propose that this ideology was, in fact, a fundamentally antisocial philosophy. If there's anything that united it, it was the antisocial themes of his ideology, right? And that fits with his antisocial personality structure in a way that, for some reason, reverberated very heavily with the spiritual seekers he attracted in California in the late 60s. But the other interesting thing is, even after his conviction and initially death sentence, which was turned into a life sentence, he's held a kind of sway over the culture that's different than other people of his ilk. I mean, for one, there were apparently, he had written all these songs, and there were like 70 bands or so were characterized by the DA who later wrote Helter Skelter as sort of pro-Manson bands. Like they would cover his songs, or they would make songs sort of praising him or at least romanticizing him. Even in the online age, there are these Charles Manson clips that get millions, sometimes tens of millions of views.
Do you feel blame? Are you mad? Do you feel like Wolf's Bob Ruffranish? Get Franish,
and usually the top comments, this is funny, I hadn't seen this top comment before. I can see why people followed him. He's got a real way with words. I mean, obviously these are jokes, but on a lot of these Charles Manson interviews, you'll actually see a kind of more sympathetic treatment of him than you might expect based on the brutality of the murders that I think everyone is aware he was responsible, that without him as the cult leader, these murders wouldn't have happened. And yet there is this tendency to romanticize Charles Manson. So what I want to do in this video is use some of the Charles Manson interviews that were conducted from prison and try to paint a picture of, what was his life and how did that inform who he became? And then also, why does he have this kind of power of influence over people, whether it was the original cult followers or this kind of subculture of semi-fandom he has even now. So there's so much to the story of the Manson family and the helter-skelter summer of 1969 murders that, you could do an entire podcast or docuseries on Charles Manson, and many people have. I'll just briefly say that in 1969, there were a string of murders, the most famous of which were the Tate LaBianca murders. These were on back-to-back nights. They were seemingly random home break-ins near Beverly Hills, California. Sharon Tate, one of the brutalized victims, was a famous actress. The blood of the victims was used to paint words onto the walls. And so in terms of there being a media firestorm, I mean, it couldn't have been more high profile of a series of murders. It essentially put California and the US as a whole into a state of panic. And so Charles Manson became one of the most feared individuals in the culture at large. And yet gradually there was this simultaneous current of fascination that seemed to develop with him. The idea of putting the country into a panic, though, that makes me think of something that I want to tie in to Charles Manson, okay? And that is the mythological Greek god Pan. So Pan was the god of shepherds and goat herds, of animals and pastures, and he himself had the appearance of a part man but also part goat. While representing the art of domestication of animals, he himself was retaining part of his feral nature. Perhaps in the same way that, goats seem to eternally retain part of their feral nature despite humanity's best efforts to domesticate them. And in Greek stories, Pan is most often seen as, playing the pipes, loving music, gallivanting through the woods, sometimes indulging in some debauchery, but was generally a beloved figure for the ancients. And yet at the same time, it was believed that Pan had this propensity towards rage when provoked that could induce a mass panic in people. So the word panic comes from Pan, right? That's its etymology. And he was also believed capable of possessing people and inducing them to commit savage acts of violence. And this was called panilepsy. Not a word that has made it into modern usage the way panic has, but another indication that Pan, with his feral undertones, might represent that part of human nature that can easily become feral. And it's interesting to consider that Charles Manson seemed to have induced a panilepsy in his followers in the summer of '69. So let's keep that in mind, and let's think about Pan as we watch these interviews.
How long have I been in jail? 34 years. 34 years. So
out of 47, you've been here 34.
I've been in jail, prison, a long time, all my life. I was raised up in here.
So the fact that he spent the majority of his life in jail, even prior to the Manson family murders, is something that he brings up often in these interviews. And he has a kind of awareness of the effects that institutionalization had on him. And I do think he's right about that. I think he was essentially raised by institutions.
I went to reform school when I was about 10, and I learned to box and cry, and I learned to do all the things that you do in reform school. Then I escaped there a bunch of times, and I went to prison, and I learned everything that you do in prison. And I talked to all the guys and asked them everything they knew. And they told me all the things they knew.
Manson never knew his biological father, and his mother spent much of his early life on drinking sprees and was arrested for assault and robbery when Charles was 4.
She was living in the Blue Moon Cafe, and she hit a dude in the head with one of them bottles of Jim Beam whiskey. She tried to hustle a few dollars on the corner, but there wasn't no money. So when she jammed this whiskey bottle upside that clown's head, he went down. She took the bread, come up and got me, and we went to Indiana.
When you were a boy, did you love your mother?
I didn't know what that was.
And so the culture of the institutions is simultaneously a replacement for caregivers and is the source of those that he looks up to. The lessons he's learned from inmates, say, have served as the proxy for the lessons you might learn from your parents. But also, he's forever affected by the fact that this is not a satisfactory replacement for actual caregivers.
So I understand jail. So I understand myself, and I can deal with that. There's a different world. I love the world I live in, too, just like Regan loves the world he lives in.
You love the world you live in.
Most assuredly, it's me.
You love all the pain that you've caused people, all the anguish you've caused.
Oh, I don't know pain. I don't know pain. I have no depth of pain. I have no depth of suffering. I don't know ridicule. I don't know all the bad things. I haven't been punished by you all my life since I was 10 years old. I've been in every reform school you got across the country, and used to lay down and have to get my ass whipped till I couldn't walk. Tell me about some pain.
And
so this is a case where he's he's getting this kind of righteous indignation about the suggestion that he's caused other people much pain. And his response is essentially, society has caused me all of this pain. What are you talking about? You don't have any right to tell me about pain, because in his mind, Tom Snyder represents society. So he starts actually talking to Tom Snyder like he is talking to society. You did all of this to me, right?
I've been in every reform school you got across the country, and used to lay down and have to get my ass whipped till I couldn't walk. Tell me about some pain.
And that's our fault. That's all those people
No
want.
fault. Make strong, good pain.
And Tom Snyder sort of saying, did I? I mean, is that really our fault? He says, sure, I'll pretend to be society. Is that our fault as representatives of society? And then Manson turns and says, no, actually, it's good. The pain is good. So he has this kind of conflicted love-hate relationship with the institutions that raised him, the institutions that are sort of outside of typical social structures, because, again, he doesn't have parents to have a love-hate relationship with, in a sense.
And that's our fault. That's all those people want.
No fault. Make strong, good pain. Understand pain. Not bad. Pain's not bad. It's good. It teaches you things. It teaches you things. Like when you put your hand in fire, you know not to do that again.
See, so he's...
Yeah, I understand that.
Written accounts indicate
So he's simultaneously he's simultaneously angry about having been punished this way, and yet doesn't want to totally dismiss it because, for better or worse, that was his caregiver. So he has that part of himself that wants to be attached to something, defending it now once someone else attacks it.
Pain's not bad. It's good. It teaches you things.
The anger he feels towards a society which he believes rejected him or offered him nothing crystallizes into an antisocial philosophy expressed as society is the problem, and to whatever extent individuals are problems, the blame lays at society. And so the only moral impetus that makes any sense is the destruction of society.
You don't feel guilty at all?
There's no need to feel guilty. I haven't done anything I'm ashamed of. Maybe I haven't done enough. I might be ashamed of that, for not doing enough, for not giving enough, for not being more perceptive, for not being aware enough, for not understanding. Maybe I should have killed 400 or 500 people, then I would have felt better. Then when I felt like I really offered society something.
He's saying, my moral system is so different. If I feel bad about anything, it's that I didn't do more to destroy society and its citizens.
On the night following the killings at the house on Cielo Drive in Los Angeles, you accompanied 4 people to a home occupied by Mr. and Mrs. Leo LaBianca.
Yeah.
That you went inside that house and you tied them up and assured them that they were not going to be hurt. That you went back outside and sent Kasabian and Krenwinkel and Watson and Atkins inside the house to kill them. True or false? Did you do that? Did you do that?
Did I kill anyone?
No. Did you go in and tie up the LaBiancas that night? Very simple question.
That night.
August 10th, 1969.
That night. August the 10th.
Did you?
1969.
Why duck it? Why dodge it? Why not answer it yes or no once and for all? Put it behind you. Why don't you want to talk about it, Charles? Why don't you want to?
Because I'm an outlaw, and I go so far, and then that's all you know.
And if you
That's
did,
like asking Jesse James.
and if
did you
and if
shoot somebody?
and if, as others have written.
So I think this is a significant insight into how Charles Manson thinks of himself. He says, I'm an outlaw, and I go as far as I can, and that's all you know. And then as Tom Snyder's trying to reintroduce the question, we can hear Charles Manson saying, that's like asking Jesse James, did you shoot someone? So the idea of being an outlaw or being like Jesse James, I think, is part of the philosophy of Charles Manson, that because society has wronged him to such an extent, He is not subject to the laws of society because he does not see himself as part of society. And he picks another figure that has been glorified as an outlaw, which is Jesse James.
And if you did,
That's like asking Jesse James.
and if
did you
and if and
shoot
if
somebody?
and
Who, despite his crimes, has a kind of romance attached to him. Charles Manson here is pretty explicitly saying, I'm not subject to the kinds of moral structures you're trying to impose on me. I'm not sure I even need to answer this question, because would you ask Jesse James if he shot someone? I'm an outlaw. Usually, antisocial behavior is not so openly articulated. Usually it's hidden. The personality shows up with these behaviors, but tries to hide behind a philosophy of benevolence of some sort. But with Manson, if he articulates anything, it is this: an outright rejection of society and its rules. There's also an interview from 1980 where when he explains why he carved a swastika into his forehead, you can also kind of get a sense of his philosophy.
What's it stand for?
It stands for whatever I mean it to stand for, and whatever I make it stand for, and whatever I want it to stand for.
What does it stand for you?
It stands for many things. And it would take 2 or 3 weeks to explain all the things that I built
Can you give me an
in
example?
the image. Certainly, I can give you an example of the United States flag of America.
The swastika.
The rising sun in the German and the Japanese flag. The Star of David to the Israelis. Whatever country or nation or people or cause has always had a symbol. I put that there from 2 or 3 other symbols. I didn't want to put a Christian symbol, and I didn't want to put an antichrist symbol, and I didn't want to put a pro-communism, and I didn't want to put an anti-thermoslacker and all that kind of stuff that you play.
But it is a swastika. That would be Germany, wouldn't it?
No, that's
It's all the same to him. Any social institution might as well be Nazi Germany. And that's the message he's trying to tell members of society to get them to revolt against society, I think. He even starts speaking in gibberish to show that to him it's all the same. It's all meaningless. It's all institutions, all of which are wrong, all of which must be destroyed.
put a Christian symbol, and I didn't want to put an antichrist symbol, and I didn't want to put a pro-communism, and I didn't want to put an anti-thermoslacker and all that kind of stuff that you play.
But it is a swastika. That would be Germany, wouldn't it?
No, that's not a Nazi. Hitler got that sign from mysticism and reversed it.
Now, he'll go on to say that, it doesn't actually represent the swastika that I have here, doesn't even represent Nazi Germany. It was a spiritual symbol before Hitler adopted it. I don't buy that part. I think he's doing it. He knows what people are going to think when they see it. And I think the subtext of the message is, I'm shocking you with the appearance of it, and then I'm going to tell you that your institutions are no better. They're all condemnable. And of course, I am simultaneously evil to you, but actually the only moral person, because in my morality, being anti-society is the only good you could have or do. So let's talk about his affect, meaning his external emotional state and how that might relate to his internal emotional states. To me, it seems like the one emotion that Manson is able to really get in touch with externally is anger. The other interview I'm predominantly referencing is the 1987 Today Show interview. So another one that was conducted from San Quentin prison, but 6 years after the Tom Snyder interview. We can also see the anger as righteous indignation at society.
I can do anything I want to you people at any time I want to, because that's what you've done to me. If you spit in my face and smack me in the mouth and throw me in solitary confinement for nothing, what do you think's going to happen when I get out of here? What do you want to call me a murderer for? I've never killed anyone. I don't need to kill anyone. I think it. I have it here.
And often what you see with people that have experienced a great deal of emotional pain as children, like if they experienced abandonment and neglect to a severe degree, anger ends up being the one emotion that they can kind of channel everything else through, because the adaptation they otherwise made was numbness. Because to the child, the emotions that they experienced during periods of abandonment or neglect were so intense that they cannot experience it as sadness at a certain point, because it would be maladaptive to have that level of fear and sadness as something that was constantly derailing the otherwise developing brain, right? It would be overwhelmed with this kind of despair, and that would not be compatible with survival. So what you see then is a kind of baseline numbness, and the one thing that sadness can get turned into is anger. So if someone does something that actually hurts them, they're not going to experience it as hurt or pain. They're going to experience it as anger that motivates action, or even rage that motivates destruction. And with Manson, we can certainly see statements that are consistent with denying any emotional depth of feeling. He'll say things like, I don't feel anything about it, or I wouldn't feel anything about it.
You like jail, don't you?
I don't dislike or like. You know, if I wanted to kill somebody, I'd take this book and beat you to death with it, and I wouldn't feel a thing. It'd be just like walking to the drugstore.
And outwardly, in his affect, other than the anger, when he is expressive, there seems to be a kind of superficial nature to it. It has the qualities of a kind of playful mask.
Tell me in a sentence who you are.
Nobody.
And sometimes he's even acknowledging that it's a playful mask, or saying, hey, I thought you said we were going into imagination mode. And then you see he has this tendency to cycle through facial expressions, because these are the masks that he knows.
Let's just play make-believe here for a second. Let's make believe. Let's make believe you're getting out tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
Okay. Would you go after anybody, Charles?
And we're making believe, right? Mm-hmm. Well, I'll tell you, buddy. Well, I don't rightly know.
And so there's a strange kind of honesty to his expressions, a strange kind of honesty that this is all just a game, this is all just play. But both the anger, which I would say is an honest outward expression of what the internal state feels like, and the superficial pretend facial expressions that are a mask against the insides, I think sometimes you can see the traces of what would be sadness on the face in a way that's unconscious. He's only experiencing it as anger, but we can actually see it at times, such as when his father comes up.
Not about as much as my father did me. I said, I got it from my father in prison. He gave it to me. I had a little charm bracelet I used to carry it on when I was about that big.
Mm-hmm. So skip that for a second.
Yeah.
Why was it so important for him to do what you say?
And when his son comes up.
All right, somewhere out there, there's at least one son that we know of that's your child, who's probably about 25 or 26 years old. You talk to that kid. What are you going to say to him?
You gotta catch it on your own, boy. Train's hard. The road's rough.
And that's it.
That's all I knew. That's all anyone ever told me.
All right.
And you want to hear something?
Yeah?
He'll do it better than me.
Do what?
Whatever he does, he'll do it a little better. Kids do, don't they?
And so here he actually converts the unconscious drive towards sadness into superficial laughter.
That's all I knew. That's all anyone ever told me.
All right.
I would say you see a sadness there. It doesn't seem like Tom Snyder is recognizing it necessarily, but I feel like you can see it. And then you can see him kind of turn that, rather than facing it consciously himself, he'll turn it into a superficial laughter here.
And you want to hear something?
Yeah.
He'll do it better than me.
Do what?
And honestly, even with this laughter,
Kids do, don't they? And you want to hear something?
Yeah.
He'll do it better than me.
I feel like you can still see the sadness in his eyes. His eyes look like eyes that are laughing through sadness. He honestly, he kind of looks like Robin Williams, just in his eyes here. Same sort of laughing through sadness. To me, that's what it looks like.
Do what? Whatever he does, he'll do it a little better.
Now, what about the question of Manson's identity? Most often we see him characterizing himself as an outlaw.
Well, I was born illegitimately. That put me on the other side of the law. I've been an outlaw ever since I was born.
Then we also can get some sense that this identity is not fixed. It seems to waver between a few different things. So there's the outlaw.
Because I'm an outlaw.
Then at other times, he will express that he's essentially a child.
I'm still 10 years old in your world. Your world, I'm still a kid. I'm not going to grow up. I'm not going to go to college. I went up to the board and they never would. They said I was incorrigible. And not only was I incorrigible, but that I'd never grow up. And I kind of agreed with them.
And he'll also waver between sort of saying, if anything, I'm just a petty criminal. I may be an outlaw, but I'm like a petty thief.
In my whole life, I've burglarized a grocery store, stole some nickels and dimes, busted open a stamp machine, stole a few automobiles, and cashed a couple checks. I'm a petty car thief.
And there's some inherent contradictions. He'll insist that he is not the monster the media has portrayed him as, right?
Boy, how insecure are we as human beings? Put all our fear on one little guy and afraid to let him out. He might break all the toys.
Why do you say little guy?
Because I'm not the guy you trying to make out of me. That's not me.
If you got out of here, there are a lot of people who think you'd go start killing people again.
Again? Mm-hmm. Well, you guys are misinformed. I haven't killed anyone.
But then other times he'll take this kind of perverse pleasure in boasting about how monstrous he actually is capable of being.
Believe me, if I started murdering people, there'd be none of you left. Maybe I should have killed 400 or 500 people, then I would have felt better. Then when I felt like I really offered society something.
And so sometimes he's the romantic, train-hopping James Dean kind of outlaw.
I was a beatnik in the 50s before the hippies came along. I cut a rut down through Acapulco, and I smoked Acapulco before you knew what it was. And I lived in the Tombs, and I was in the Cook County Jail in Chicago when you were playing cricket in high school, see? Like you live in another world. I live in street people's world. I'm a tramp, a bum, a hobo. I'm a boxcar and a jug of wine.
And at other times, he's the kind of worst nightmare, the beast in human form.
Now you do what I say. And he said, no. I said, you do exactly what I say. And he said, no. I'm telling you. I'm not asking you. I'm telling you. You do exactly what I say.
So he'll also let slip a little bit of narcissism because he'll say here, I'm a street person, right? I'm an urchin. I'm a street outlaw. I hang around with street people. Those are my people. I don't go uptown and do anything fancy. Well, I could, it's not that I couldn't do it. I could do anything, right? He has these moments of just grandiosity slipping in.
I've been with prostitutes and bums and winos and all my life. The street is my world. I don't pretend to go uptown and be anything fancy. I can, but I find more real in the world that I'm in.
But as far as the identity goes, I think the wavering instability of the identity is in line with cluster B disorders, wherein the true self, as I often talk about, was not allowed to form as just like a true experience of the world during childhood. And so the identities that are latched onto are sort of transiently latched onto. They'll switch between different things like a chameleon as the environment demands it. But it is interesting that the ones that he latches on most often are outlaw, child, and beast, right? And what do all of these things have in common? The outlaw, the child, the beast, non-domesticated, right? The outlaw has decided to live by his own rules, so he's not playing the domestic society game. The child is pre-domestication, right? You know, I think Peter Pan, right? So while in Greek mythology, Pan was our species' primal memory of a pre-society type of human, or perhaps even a borderline Homo sapiens kind of memory. I don't know how far back our collective unconscious memory goes, but Pan is a sort of on the species level. It's this romantic memory of Eden, right? Before we were subject to the laws of society and domesticity and agrarian culture and all of that. And we all have a little bit of romance towards getting back to Eden. Peter Pan, I would say on the individual level, represents the nostalgia we all have for childhood. So the species nostalgia is for Pan, the part feral human. The individual nostalgia is for childhood, when things were uncomplicated and we were ourselves not yet subject to the complexities of social etiquette and being civilized. And then the third identity is the beast, right? And that's the Pan part. So Charles Manson is an outlaw raised by institutions that are themselves the sort of outside of society, Lord of the Flies kinds of institutions. He's the child, the Peter Pan, who is only went Lord of the Flies because he was in that kind of society. And he's the beast who was never domesticatable in the first place. He is the goat, not the greatest of all time, just the animal, the goat, right? He's like Pan. I think then to people that see Charles Manson, he is Pan with an urban landscape. You know, the Greek mythological Pan had this pastoral landscape. If you supplant that into modern society with its concrete jungles, what would Pan look like? Perhaps he would be a hippie songwriter, but also a dangerous fiend who was never domesticated by society and is capable of inducing a panelepsy. What makes Manson dangerous is that society is not perfect, and all of us feel, to more or less degree, the pangs of an imperfect society and frustration at it. When we see someone who so impishly disdains society, I think we all have some degree of a draw towards that. And so in a way, it's much easier to be put off by the dishonest antisocial types who are pretending to be good than it is to be put off by the honest antisocial type we see in Charles Manson. But of course, how much of the draw you feel may correlate with how connected to society you feel at a given moment. I think the idea of panelepsy, the idea of a regression into pre-civilization levels of brutal predatory acts and aggression, really reflects the primal ability we all have to regress into a pre-civilization state. People like Charles Manson are frightening for the same reason that they're charming. We don't want to be reminded of how easy it is to regress back into a pre-civilized state of animal instincts. Although for those that do decide that society has nothing for them, it's remarkably easy to follow him because he's speaking to something that is deep-seated. However, I have no interest in defending him. I think that for the most part, while his answers seem pseudo-intellectual, his philosophy is guilty of the problem with most antisocial types of philosophy, which is he proposes nothing of an alternative. What he has is criticism of society and anger at society, but he does not offer any hope. And so he is a false prophet, wearing the outfit of Pan, but Charles Manson's garb was adorned through the prison system, the modern and urban version of a outlaw society.
And in virtual reality, it's all